All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep into a topic that's both fascinating and incredibly complex:
Yeah,
the history and the future of the Kurdish people.
absolutely.
Now, you sent over some really interesting notes
Yeah.
from a book called Greater Kurdistan: History, Struggles, and the Quest for Freedom
Mm-hmm.
by Karzan Berdosti.
Yes.
And we're going to be using that as our main source today.
Sounds good.
Now, have you ever heard of a group of people who share a culture and a language but are spread across 4 different countries?
That's a tough situation for sure.
That's the reality for the Kurds.
Yeah.
And their fight for autonomy is something that I think everyone should know about.
Definitely a story that really highlights how messy history can be
Yeah,
and how those messy borders impact people's lives even today.
exactly. So to really grasp this,
Yeah.
we need to start with the basics.
Yeah.
Who are the Kurds? I feel like most people have heard the name,
Sure.
but beyond that, it gets a little fuzzy.
It is fuzzy.
Yeah.
And that's partly by design, sadly. The Kurds are a diverse group, not a monolith, as you might hear sometimes.
Okay.
They've got various traditions and backgrounds, but they're connected by a shared language, culture, and a homeland known as Greater Kurdistan.
Okay.
And interestingly, even though they've faced a lot of suppression,
Hmm.
they're known for their hospitality, resilience, and a strong sense of community.
Okay, so Greater Kurdistan, that's the heart of the matter, right? It's
Yeah.
not some recognized country on a map.
All right.
So that already tells us there's a story here.
That is the key.
Yeah.
Greater Kurdistan, as it's conceived, is spread across parts of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria.
Wow.
So imagine trying to maintain a unified identity when you're literally divided by borders you had no say in creating.
Yeah.
That's a major source of the conflict we see.
Oh, that's a recipe for tension right there.
It is.
So how did this even happen? Was it always like this?
Unfortunately, no. We need to go back to the Ottoman Empire, which ruled over the Kurdish region for centuries.
Okay.
Now, the Ottomans, like many empires, weren't big on diversity.
Right.
They had assimilation policies that often meant suppressing Kurdish language and culture.
So just being Kurdish meant you were already starting from a disadvantage.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But it gets more complicated.
Sad.
When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, European powers stepped in.
Oh, wow.
Think of it like they were dividing up a pie, creating new countries, without much regard for the people already living there.
Right.
This further divided the Kurds, placing them under the rule of multiple, often hostile governments.
That's like adding insult to injury.
It is.
You're already dealing with suppression,
Yeah,
and then you get chopped up and placed under new rulers.
exactly.
No wonder the concept of Kurdish nationalism emerged.
Yeah.
I mean, were they inspired by what was happening elsewhere in the world at the time?
Exactly. In the early 20th century, you see a global rise in nationalism,
Right.
people wanting to rule themselves, preserve their cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And the Kurds were no different.
Yeah.
Organizations advocating for self-determination started popping up. They weren't just going to sit back and accept this fate.
And it wasn't just talk, right? They actually took action.
They did.
I'm seeing some notes here about an uprising led by Sheikh Said.
Yes, in 1925, Sheikh Said led a major uprising against the Turkish government.
Okay.
It was a direct challenge to the suppression they'd been facing.
Mm-hmm.
Though it was eventually put down, it was a powerful symbol of the Kurdish desire for autonomy.
Yeah.
You can almost say it foreshadowed the decades of struggle to come.
So this is more than just wanting a flag or a national anthem.
It is.
This is about survival, about having control over your own destiny.
Absolutely. And the 20th century only intensified these struggles.
Right.
There was ongoing suppression, persecution, and displacement of countless Kurds from their homes.
Wow.
And then there's the extremely sensitive issue of the Kurdish genocide,
Yeah.
which is a very dark chapter.
It's a tough topic to discuss, but I think it's crucial for a listener to understand just how much hardship the Kurdish people have faced. The book doesn't shy away from this, does it?
Not at all. The book details the systematic suppression of their culture and language.
Yeah.
And the fact that the Turkish government still denies the existence of the Kurdish genocide only adds to the complexity.
Right.
There's a real debate surrounding this issue.
Hmm.
A wound that hasn't healed, a source of immense pain and trauma.
Yeah.
This is coupled with the displacement of so many Kurds due to conflicts and political shifts,
Right.
reminding us that this fight for self-determination has come at a heavy human cost.
It really makes you realize that this isn't just history in a textbook, it's people's lives.
It is.
And speaking of fighting for survival, we can't ignore the role of armed resistance, especially the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga.
Right.
Their very name, those who face death, says a lot about their commitment.
You've picked up on something really interesting there.
Yeah.
Naming themselves those who face death isn't just dramatic. It shows how deeply ingrained the idea of resistance is in Kurdish culture. They've been fighting against the Iraqi government and others for decades.
And it seems like the first Gulf War was a turning point for them.
Yeah.
It created a power vacuum in northern Iraq,
Right.
which allowed them to gain ground and establish a de facto independent region under the Kurdistan Regional Government, or KRG.
Right. And that's where you start to see the Kurds not just resisting, but building.
Okay.
They've managed to establish a thriving economy, built cultural institutions,
Right.
and really demonstrated their capacity for self-governance.
Yeah.
It's an amazing example of what they can achieve when given even a sliver of opportunity.
That's incredibly inspiring. But I'm guessing it hasn't been all smooth sailing.
Yeah.
What are some of the unique challenges they face in governing themselves?
Well, for starters, full independence is still elusive.
Right.
And the path to lasting peace and recognition is rarely easy. They face constant pressure from neighboring countries, internal divisions,
Yeah.
and the ever-present threat of violence. But even with all that, the Kurds in Iraq have shown incredible strength and determination in building a relatively stable and prosperous region.
Okay, so we've got this picture of resilience,
Yes.
but also the reality of these massive obstacles they face. Before we jump into those,
Sure.
there's one more piece of the puzzle that I find particularly interesting.
Okay.
The Rojava Revolution.
Yeah.
This seems like something completely different from what we've talked about so far.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is where things get really fascinating
Okay.
and a bit hopeful, which is a nice change of pace.
All right, I'm hooked. We'll have to dive into that in the next part of our deep dive.
For sure.
Don't go anywhere, folks. The story's just getting started.
Definitely not.
All right, we'll be right back.
We'll be back.
Okay, we left off on a bit of a cliffhanger.
We did.
The Rojava Revolution.
Yeah.
It seems like something totally unexpected happened
It did.
amidst all the chaos of the Syrian civil war.
Absolutely. It really is a surprising turn of events. Remember, the Kurds in Syria were dealing with decades of oppression under the Assad regime.
Right.
But when the civil war broke out, it created an unexpected opportunity for them to carve out their own space.
And they didn't just declare independence or try to replicate what the KRG was doing in Iraq, right?
Right.
What makes Rojava so unique?
You're right. It's not a copy-paste situation.
Yeah.
They went a step further and established a truly different model of governance
Okay.
based on direct democracy, social justice, and women's rights.
Wow.
It's fascinating how they took these progressive ideals and actually put them into practice.
It's like they looked at all the issues plaguing the region and said,
Right.
we're going to try something radically different.
Exactly.
But I'm also thinking, doing all this during a civil war?
Yeah,
That takes some serious guts.
it absolutely does. And it's captured a lot of international attention.
Yeah.
Rojava's commitment to these values, especially in such a volatile region, is truly remarkable. Just think about it. They have women serving in their armed forces, fighting alongside men.
Right.
This is unheard of in many parts of the Middle East.
That's a powerful image of change.
It is.
But I'm guessing it's not all rosy,
Yeah.
our source material.
Right.
Brodowski talks about external threats and internal tensions too, right?
Exactly. Rojava is constantly under threat.
Right.
The Syrian government wants to regain control. Turkey sees Kurdish autonomy as a threat.
Yeah.
And then there's the ongoing fight against ISIS.
Wow.
On top of that, you have different Kurdish factions within Rojava itself,
Right.
each with their own vision for the future.
Yeah.
So you have to imagine governing under these conditions is incredibly challenging.
So while they're trying to build this new society,
Yeah,
they've also got to defend it on multiple fronts.
they do.
That's got to be exhausting.
It is.
What does Brodowski say about how they managed to hold on?
Well, one thing that stands out is their emphasis on community and cooperation.
Okay.
Their model of governance is very grassroots,
Right.
with a focus on local councils and direct participation. This helps create a sense of ownership and shared responsibility,
Yeah.
which is crucial when you're facing constant pressure from the outside.
That makes sense. It's like that old saying,
Yeah,
united we stand, divided we fall.
exactly.
But even with strong community bonds, I can't help but think about the sheer power they're up against.
Sure.
You've got Turkey, a major military force directly to their north.
Right.
And then there's the Syrian government, which is no stranger to using brute force.
Mm.
How do they even begin to defend themselves against that?
Well, the People's Protection Units, or YPG, are their primary defense force.
Okay.
They've gained a reputation for being incredibly effective, especially against ISIS.
Right.
But they're still outmatched in terms of traditional military might.
Right.
Their strategy relies heavily on guerrilla tactics, local knowledge, and international support.
International support.
Yes.
Are there any countries actually backing them up?
What?
I know there's sympathy for the Kurds. Yeah.
But actually getting involved in a messy conflict like the Syrian civil war, that seems risky.
It is risky, and that's why most countries have been hesitant to offer full-fledged military support.
Okay.
However, there have been instances of cooperation, particularly in the fight against ISIS.
Right.
The U.S., for example, provided air support and training to the YPG,
Okay.
recognizing them as a valuable ally in that fight.
Right.
But politically, it's very tricky.
Yeah.
Supporting Kurdish autonomy in Syria risks upsetting Turkey, a NATO ally.
So it's a classic example of real politics, right?
Sadly, yes.
Like, we'd love to help, but
Yeah.
our interests lie elsewhere.
For our listener who might not be familiar with the term,
Yeah.
realpolitik basically means that countries often prioritize their own interests and power
Right.
above ethical considerations. And in this case, the Kurdish desire for self-determination gets caught in the crossfire.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But it's still frustrating.
If the Kurds have shown they can govern themselves, fight for their own freedom, and create a more just society, why aren't more countries stepping up to support them?
Right.
What's the real obstacle to them getting full independence, not just in Rojava,
Yeah.
but across Greater Kurdistan?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And to really understand it, we have to zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
The geopolitical chessboard, if you will.
Okay, zoom us out. What are we missing?
The simple answer, and it's never that simple,
Right.
is that the countries that control parts of Greater Kurdistan, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, they're not keen on giving up that territory.
Right.
They see an independent Kurdistan as a threat to their own national unity and territorial integrity.
But isn't that kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy? If you constantly suppress a group's identity and deny them their rights,
Yeah.
isn't it more likely that they'll eventually revolt and demand independence?
That's a very valid point.
Yeah.
And Berdowsi touches on this in the book. He argues that these countries' fears of Kurdish separatism actually fuel the very movement they're trying to suppress.
Right.
It becomes a vicious cycle of repression and resistance.
Yeah.
But these fears are not entirely unfounded.
Okay, I'm listening. What are they so afraid of?
Well, let's start with Turkey.
Okay.
They have a significant Kurdish population within their own borders. And they fought a long and bloody conflict with the PKK,
Right.
a Kurdish separatist group. So they see the emergence of an independent Kurdistan, especially one right next door,
Yeah.
as a potential catalyst for their own Kurdish population to demand more autonomy or even secession.
So it's like they're looking at Rojava and thinking,
Right.
if they can do it, what's to stop our own Kurdish population from getting ideas?
Exactly. And it's not just Turkey.
Okay.
Iran and Iraq have similar concerns,
Right.
though their situations are a bit different.
Okay.
Iran has a smaller Kurdish population, but they still worry about Kurdish nationalism spreading across their borders and potentially destabilizing the country.
Right.
Iraq, on the other hand, has a much larger and more autonomous Kurdish region already, the KRG,
Right.
but they still, fearful Kurdish independence, might lead to the breakup of the country.
So it's not just about land or resources.
Right.
It's about the potential domino effect of Kurdish self-determination.
Right.
But is it really fair to hold back an entire people's aspirations just because of what might happen in neighboring countries?
That's a question many people are asking.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of the ethical dilemma surrounding the Kurdish issue.
Right.
There's a growing sense that the Kurds have a legitimate claim to self-determination, but the geopolitical realities make it extremely difficult to achieve.
Right.
And there's another layer of complexity we need to consider.
Oh.
Internal divisions within the Kurdish movement itself.
Oh, right. We talked about that a little earlier.
We did.
You're saying the Kurds aren't necessarily a united front when it comes to their goals.
They're not, while they share the common goal of Kurdish rights and self-determination. There are differences in ideology, strategy, and leadership.
Right.
among various Kurdish groups and factions.
Okay.
This lack of complete unity makes it harder for them to present a cohesive front on the international stage
Right.
and negotiate effectively with regional powers.
So it's like they're fighting on two fronts.
Yeah.
Against external pressure from powerful neighbors and against internal divisions that weaken their overall position.
Exactly.
It seems almost impossible to overcome. Is there any hope for them at all?
Well, I wouldn't say it's impossible,
Okay.
but it's definitely a challenging situation.
Yeah.
But there are some glimmers of hope.
Okay.
In recent years, there's been growing international recognition of Kurdish rights and the need for a political solution.
Okay.
The world is starting to pay attention to their plight,
Mm-hmm.
and there's increasing support for their aspirations,
Right.
at least in principle.
Okay, so the world is watching, but what does that actually mean for the Kurds?
Right.
Is anyone willing to put their money where their mouth is and actually support their independence?
That's where things get even more complicated.
Okay.
While there's growing sympathy for the Kurdish cause,
Right.
global powers have been hesitant to fully endorse their independence.
Mm.
They're worried about destabilizing the region, upsetting the balance of power,
Yeah.
and potentially sparking further conflict.
It's like the world is acknowledging the Kurdish struggle, but is too afraid to rock the boat and fully support their right to self-determination.
It is.
What a catch-22.
It really is. It leaves the Kurds in a precarious position,
Right.
caught between the aspirations of their people and the geopolitical realities of the region.
Yeah.
But before we get too bogged down in the complexities of international relations, let's circle back to something you mentioned earlier,
Right.
the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. The idea that by suppressing Kurdish identity, these countries might actually be making an independent Kurdistan more likely in the long run.
Exactly. And Berdowski makes a compelling case for this in the book.
Okay.
He argues that the more these countries try to control and assimilate the Kurds, the more they risk alienating them. But the Kurds are known for their resilience, their ability to adapt and persevere, even in the most difficult circumstances.
I'm really starting to see that
Yeah,
their story is one of constant struggle,
it is.
but also one of incredible strength and determination.
Yes.
It's inspiring, but also heartbreaking.
I think that's a very honest assessment.
Yeah.
The Kurdish experience is full of both tragedy and triumph,
Right.
and understanding their story is crucial for anyone who wants to grasp the complexities of the Middle East and the challenges of building a more just and peaceful world.
Well said. And with that, I think it's a good place to pause.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
and I can tell our listener's mind is probably racing with thoughts and questions.
I'm sure.
But fear not, we'll be back with the final part of our deep dive to try and make sense of it all.
We will.
Stay tuned.
We'll be back.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the Kurdish experience. We've talked about their history, their struggles, their aspirations, but after all that, I keep coming back to one question. What now? What does the future hold for the Kurds?
Yeah, it's the big question hanging over everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
And truthfully, there's no easy answer, no crystal ball to tell us what's going to happen. The Middle East is just so unpredictable. But I guess what we can do is kind of look at the trends we've talked about
Right.
and maybe explore some possible paths forward.
Okay, so let's speculate a little. What are some of the scenarios that Berdowski lays out in the book?
Well, one possibility is that things basically stay the same,
Okay.
The Kurds keep pushing for more autonomy and recognition, working within the existing countries and borders.
Right.
So that means more negotiations, more political maneuvering, and, probably still more conflict.
It's more of a long game.
Yeah.
It's like slowly working towards more self-determination, but no guarantee of actual full independence.
Right. It's a path that needs a lot of patience, resilience, and a willingness to compromise. And, of course, a lot depends on whether those regional powers, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, whether they're even willing to give the Kurds any real autonomy or respect their rights.
And based on what we've talked about, that seems like a big if.
It is, yeah.
Okay, but what about the flip side?
Yeah.
Is there any scenario where we might actually see an independent Kurdistan, like on the map?
It's not impossible, but it would take a huge shift, like a total shakeup of the geopolitical landscape.
Wow.
Like, imagine a major upheaval in the region, alliances changing on a global scale, or maybe even the world finally agreeing that the only solution is a Kurdish state.
So something drastic would have to happen to make those big powers rethink their whole stance on the Kurdish issue.
Right. It's like those times in history when everything flips upside down and what seemed impossible suddenly becomes possible.
Yeah.
But those moments don't come around often, and who knows what might trigger them.
Okay, so we've got the long game, working within the system, and then this wild card of a major geopolitical earthquake.
Right.
Both come with their own challenges and uncertainties.
Absolutely.
But what about the Kurds themselves?
Yeah.
What does Berdosti say about their vision for the future?
Well, that's where things get even more, well, tricky.
Okay.
Remember we said earlier that the Kurdish movement isn't totally unified?
Right.
There are different groups, different leaders, different ways of thinking.
Yeah.
Some say independence is the only goal, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Others are more practical, focusing on getting more autonomy and rights within the existing countries.
Okay.
And then you've got different approaches, too. Diplomacy, armed struggle, political activism. There's no one answer that everyone agrees on.
So even if everything lined up perfectly for independence, there's no guarantee that the Kurds themselves would agree on what that should look like or how to get there.
Yeah, that's the tough part, and it's something important for our listener to remember. The Kurdish story isn't some simple good guys versus bad guys narrative.
Right.
There are complex motivations, alliances that shift, and even sometimes conflict within the Kurdish community itself.
It's a reminder that even within a group that shares a big goal, there can be a lot of different opinions and ways of thinking about how to reach that goal.
Absolutely, and I think that makes it even harder for people outside the situation to really understand what's happening.
For sure. And it's important to avoid those simple black and white views.
It is.
The Kurdish experience is full of nuance, and to really understand it, you have to be ready to deal with that complexity.
Couldn't agree more.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm honestly left with such admiration for the Kurdish people, their resilience, their determination. But I also feel a bit overwhelmed by just how complicated this whole situation is.
I think that's a pretty natural reaction.
Yeah.
The Kurdish story is one of those that's full of both really high highs and really low lows.
Right.
It makes you question what you think you know about power and politics. And in the end, you're left with more questions than answers.
That's the beauty of a deep dive, though, isn't it?
It is.
We're not trying to give easy answers or wrap everything up perfectly. We're trying to spark curiosity, to get our listener thinking and wanting to learn more, to form their own understanding of this complex issue.
Couldn't have said it better myself, and if there's one thing I hope our listener takes away from all this, it's that the Kurdish story is far from over.
Absolutely.
It deserves our attention, our empathy, and our willingness to really engage with the complexities of the world.
So well said. We've explored the history, the struggles, the hopes of the Kurdish people, and we've used Karzan Bernasti's insightful book, Greater Kurdistan, History, Struggles, and the Quest for Freedom as our guide. And for our listener, we'll leave you with this. Given everything we've discussed, what path do you think gives the Kurds the best chance of reaching their goals? It's a question worth thinking about and maybe even researching further on your own, because the Kurdish story continues. Their journey towards self-determination isn't over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.